Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Mailbox for the 17th of September 2012. My name is TotalBiscuit, bringing you your daily dose of community interaction, gaming discussion, and all that good stuff. You can email in mailbox@cynicalbrit.com, that's mailbox@cynicalbrit.com, with topics for future shows. The game in the background is a little bit of Torchlight 2 there from Act 1. You'll be seeing more Torchlight 2 footage throughout the week as we come up to the launch there on the 20th. I do have a VOD, a very long VOD, a 4-hour stream available on twitch.tv/TotalBiscuit, which is essentially me playing the entirety of Act 1, if you so desire to have a look at it. First email comes in here from RobbiePack7 that says, "Hello Mr. Biscuit, being a huge fan of base-building strategy games, I find it very disappointing that this kind of genre is slowly dying out. What I mean by this is that developers, for some reason, try to leave base-building elements behind. Good examples would be Tiberian Twilight or Warhammer 40,000. That being Dawn of War 2, by the way, not the original. That did have base-building in it. And why on earth so many other developers insist on creating more MMORPGs that no one's going to play rather than creating a good game within the genre that has low numbers of new releases? I sincerely hope that CNC Generals 2 will be a major success, as it will be the most realistic strategy game in the world with a good old base-building element back in. I'd like to know your opinion as to why these base-building elements have become so unpopular in video game company offices today. Firstly, do you really think that CNC Generals 2 is going to be the most realistic strategy game in the world? On what grounds do you believe this, bearing in mind that the original CNC Generals had ion cannons, hypersonic bombers, toxin trucks, and nuclear artillery cannons? That's not, of course, to mention what happened with 0 Hour, the Laser General. The Laser General. Everything has lasers on it. Literally everything has lasers on it in that. God. No. Let's just throw the idea out of the window right now that Generals was ever a realistic game. The thing about Generals was that it had at least some basis in reality. It had the Comanche helicopter, it had the MiG fighter jet, it had things that kind of make sense, and then there was a bunch of stuff that clearly didn't. Generals 2 is a little bit further in the future. The screenshots I've seen include dual-rotor hover planes of some description that clearly do not exist, as well as a bunch of other stuff, so, no. The second problem with Generals 2 is that it only just got a single-player experience. The fact that they had to listen to fan feedback to include a single-player boggles the mind. This is a free-to-play game, yeah, which is in itself a very risky prospect. I know of some free-to-play RTSs, there aren't a lot of them, but one of them is End of Nations, which does not contain base building at all. And indeed, the free-to-play model really does not lend itself well to the idea of base building RTS. It's very difficult to properly monetize that and actually remain balanced. When it comes to base building RTS in the traditional sense, the only really important one at the moment has got to be StarCraft 2. Company of Heroes 2 still has base building, and of course we've just kickstarted Planetary Annihilation, which will certainly have base building in it as well, but aside from that, no, there aren't all that many base building centric RTSs. The move away from base building, I think, started quite some time ago, and there was a very, very good game that didn't involve base building at all called World in Conflict, and that wasn't the first. In fact, the company that made World in Conflict also made Ground Control, which was actually one of the first RTSs whereby base building was not a factor. Now, one has to wonder, is base building archaic? Is it out of date? Is it a mechanic that simply should not be in RTSs anymore? That is a very difficult debate to have, because there are plenty of good examples of both. I mean, there are good RTS games that do not involve base building. Ground Control 1 and 2, as well as World in Conflict, are really good examples, and Dawn of War 2 is also a really good example of a game that did not have base building and yet was very good nonetheless. But you can also look at things like Dawn of War 1, which was also a really good game and did involve base building, StarCraft 2, of course, and then things like Company of Heroes. Now, some would argue that base building in Company of Heroes actually kind of sucked, to the point where the British faction in the opposing front's expansion pack really minimized that. It cut it down to its bare essentials, and some would argue that the base building gets in the way. It's there because it is part of old school RTS. It's been there since Herzog Zwei, it's been there since Dune 2, and of course then into Command & Conquer, so why would you get rid of it? But it does encourage a particular way of play, and some people believe that the fact that you have to create a base means that build orders become too important, and build orders can be a little bit difficult for newer players to learn. It puts them off and things like that. You can have build order wins, which don't even come down to strategy per se, it comes down to blind countering your opponent. This can still happen in current RTS, as StarCraft 2 is a really popular esport, and build orders are actually vital there. So I think maybe StarCraft 2 actually shows the counter-argument to that, saying, oi, this is effective at the highest possible levels of competitive play, so base building should certainly be a factor, and there is no RTS that does not involve base building, which is very popular, unless, of course, you count Dota-style games, which, quite frankly, I don't. At the end of the day, I feel that it's probably just another genre cycle. We will most likely get a lot more of these games at some point in the not-too-distant future. We get droughts of them, and then they come along and say, hey, you know what we haven't made in a while? Yeah, real-time strategy, that might be a plan. And then we get one of those. Currently, we're going through this phase with Diablo-style games, and it's probably because of Diablo, but we're getting Grim Dawn, we're getting Realm of Ancient War, and of course Torchlight 2 on the horizon. So that is a genre which has made a comeback. I have no doubt that RTS with base building will do so. We'll have to see a couple more popular entries in the genre, though. I think CNC Generals 2 has got to do well, so has Company of Heroes, and hopefully End of Nations will as well, even though that doesn't actually have base building, because it shows a renewed interest in the RTS genre, and then of course you get more games coming out over the next few years as a direct result of that. We'll see how it turns out. This one comes in from Forbidden War that says, EA Games president Frank Gibeau, at least I assume that's how you pronounce it, clarified his statement about not greenlighting single-player games in a recent Kotaku article by Evan Nart. Like, come on, really? These aren't real names. Gibeau says you need to have a connected social experience where you're part of a large community. He also went on to say that EA will still publish single-player games as long as they have a multiplayer component with an open-world game that's a connected experience where you can actually see other players. You can cooperate, you can compete, and it can be social. I feel this stance will let EA get more into the niche of multiplayer only and out of the single-player game experience, as their games will be forced to include social features in order to be green-lit. And that's fine, but there seems to be an irrational fear online that where EA games go, the whole industry will follow, and there seems to be many who still prefer the single-player over the multiplayer. I can't agree with the idea that games have to be social in order to be a quality experience, but the fact that a president of a major game producer seems to believe this is a little troubling. What are your thoughts? I think the attitude's pretty dumb, honestly. I think the last thing that I want in my single player is to be constantly reminded that there are other people on the internet doing the same thing I am, and then, even worse, potentially having their dumb stuff enter my game. Get out of my world. I play single player games to get away from the internet, not to be connected further to it. If I want to be connected and talk to other people, I will play a multiplayer game, just as if I want to be social, I will go out of the house rather than staying inside the house. It's a choice that you make. Not everyone wants to be social all the time. In fact, there are very few people that do. Sometimes you just need some me time. And that's what a single-player game often is. It allows me to focus on the game and forget about everything else, which is why single-player games are, of course, so important. I feel that this intrusive stuff is, quite frankly, contrary to what single-player games actually mean. Either make a multiplayer game, or make a single-player game. Have a game with a single-player mode and a multiplayer mode. That's fine, nothing wrong with that. But don't unnecessarily mix the multiplayer into the single-player unless it can be turned off somehow. There are examples of this being done pretty well. An example would be Sleeping Dogs, for instance, which has this social aspect to it whereby you are compared against your friends and challenges can be set for various different things. I just want to point out, though, that that is an option in the game that can be very easily turned off. Dust Force is another example, a precision platformer which allows you to compare high scores with pretty much everybody. Also a very cool thing indeed. But please, for the love of God, do not put things into your single-player game that allow my friends or indeed other people to bother me while I'm playing. There's a reason why I have my Steam chat and friends list usually turned off, because if I'm playing a game, the last thing I want to have happen is to be pestered by somebody. I don't care. If I'm playing video games, this is kind of either my work time or my free time, and I think that applies to a lot of people, especially when it comes to free time. You often play single-player games to escape reality. It's escapism. There's nothing wrong with that. It's entirely reasonable. It's the same reason why you watch television, or read books, or go to the movies, or any number of other activities which involve some kind of either creativity or fiction. What you do not do is have a single-player experience be interrupted by others consistently. I can only imagine what they're going to be doing with Dragon Age 3. I mean, what do they have to do? Do they have to either put a multiplayer mode in or have a single-player mode with some kind of social aspect? No, don't break me out of the universe. Don't ruin my immersion because some guy in a suit thinks that social is the next big thing. Okay, we get it. You've had some success on mobile devices with social gaming. There's nothing inherently wrong with social gaming. For those who actually like it, you've had success on Facebook with that. That's great. But I don't want it in my RPG. I have to wonder if developers are simply going to be forced into putting a multiplayer mode in their game just to get around this. Like, we want to make a single-player game. Well, you've got two choices. Either you've got to have some stupid, interconnected, open-world social gaming nonsense in your single-player, which will no doubt completely wreck the immersion. Or, alternatively, you need to put a multiplayer mode in it, which also is not really all that necessary. I think an example of that would, of course, be Mass Effect 3. I think the worst thing that they did with Mass Effect 3 wasn't the inclusion of the multiplayer mode. Hell, I played the multiplayer beta extensively and I enjoyed it. It was good. It was pretty damn fun as far as I'm concerned. But what they did do is also tie the multiplayer into the single player in such a way that it was almost impossible to get a really good completion rate without having actually played the multiplayer in the first place, which is not necessarily what you want to be doing. My fear is that EA games will become that, where the multiplayer mode affects the single-player mode, and you cannot optimally play the single-player mode without playing the multiplayer mode. These things should be separate, as far as I'm concerned. I've advocated selling them separately in certain situations, so the last thing I want is my single-player and my multiplayer to be interconnected. But I suppose it depends as to whether or not EA actually stays relevant over the next couple of years. Stock continues to drop, they're not putting out a great number of awesome titles aimed at the core gamer. We will see how things turn out for them. This one comes in from Michelle. It says, myself and a couple of friends were recently discussing the topic you covered in one of your podcasts, that being adult content in video games. We came to the conclusion that you mainly see games try to evoke anger, fear, horror, or lust, which can be viewed as adult themes in the right context, but rarely do they push much further. The two I know of are the new Tomb Raider and Spec Ops: The Line, which seem to be going for a greater picture. In Tomb Raider, it seems that they're trying to use fear in a different light, trying to make you want to succeed because of what could happen to Lara, whereas Spec Ops tries to portray the horrors of war, while trying to make the gamer see how other similar games could have a disturbing impact personally and to society. So my question is, what do you feel would be good adult content in video games, and how would you actually implement it? Honestly, when it comes to so-called adult content, it's not really something that concerns me greatly. I think it's too general a term. It's very easy to say, oh, this is adult because there's tits in it, or this is adult because there's a lot of violence in it, or there's drug themes, or something along those lines, and none of those things are really interesting to me in video games all that much. Ironically enough, I would actually say that those aspects are deliberately aimed at teenagers, even though, of course, the companies would never admit it. Those kind of things are exciting to teenagers. Come on, if you are a teenager right now, or you remember being a teenager, I certainly remember being a teenager, and if I heard about games that had those things in it, it was like, ooh, that sounds really awesome, that sounds adult, you know, I want to try that out. I want to see the game with the tits in it, I want to see the game with the extreme violence in it, so it's like, hey, let's play BMX XXX, which turned out to be absolutely terrible, or of course, Soldier of Fortune, or Kingpin, for instance, and these games didn't actually end up being all that great, unfortunately, because that's really all they had going for them. But I think when it comes to adult themes, the really important thing to look at is the idea of complexity, and complexity often comes in the form of moral ambiguity. That's something that some video games do well and others really not so much. Some go a little bit too far with. I like to point out the original Witcher, for instance, was praised by some people for its adult storyline and dark themes, but what I would argue is that while yes, it did have those things, the problem is everything in that game was morally ambiguous. It's like you couldn't do right no matter what you did, which was actually very frustrating from a role-playing standpoint. It's like, I'm trying to be the good guy here, but all of these choices are bad. I don't think every single choice should end up being bad in order to create that adult experience. In fact, that's actually so extreme that it can take you out of the experience. It can ruin your immersion. And I think what you need is a good mix of obviously right, obviously wrong choices. You can have the gray areas. In fact, you more often than not should, but you need to present them in a non-binary way. You can't just have one or the other. And that's where things get really complicated, because it's not necessarily about the fact that developers can't grasp adult themes. Developers are adults themselves. They absolutely can do that. It's It's just that actually programming a game that really deals well with adult themes and has that many choices so that it's very much non-binary in its decision making instead of push button A or push button B is difficult. It's very, very difficult indeed. And that complexity when it comes to telling a story also must be present in the actual design and game mechanics, because this is not a film, this is not a television show. You've got to think about how it plays as well as the story that you're telling. There are games that have done this, and Planescape Torment, I think, is held up as a shining example of truly adult storytelling. It's very complex in its themes, and it can make you, as the main character, feel like a very, very bad person, which is something that most games really don't do. It's the idea of the anti-hero, but played in a very, very good way. Perhaps someone seeking redemption, or just descending into this ever-growing more of sadness and sorrow. Most games put you as the hero, and it's a very binary thing. It's like, you are the hero, you are the good guy, these guys are the bad guys, kill them. That is a very immature way of looking at things, and it should be blindingly obvious, because all you're doing with, say, Gears of War is essentially playing cowboys and Indians, or cops and robbers. It's the same principle. Good guy, bad guy. We did these things as children very often, and with good reason, because this binary morality is very easy to understand. What isn't easy to understand is that your character might not actually be doing the right thing, even though you thought you were. Or the really difficult thing to do is to create a situation where you are willing to do the wrong thing, and it's not just because of some kind of sadistic desire. Couple of examples of games doing this badly. 1. Fable. You have to make some seriously ridiculous choices in order to be evil, and it's mustache-twirling evil. It's almost comical. It's a caricature. The same thing I would say for the original Knights of the Old Republic. I think that KOTOR 2 did it much better. Honestly, I feel that Obsidian are far, far better at understanding those kind of situations, whereas BioWare really view morality in a very binary way. It's light and dark, white and black. It's immature, although I will say that lately they have got just a little bit better at that, if only because the original Dragon Age played it really, really well. I am perhaps surprised that we don't get more adult or mature games, bearing in mind that the average age of the gamer is indeed in the adult range, but we are still very much held back by the kind of games that people seem to enjoy. Do people really want very complex character development? Do they really want tough decisions to make? Do they want a narrative which evolves over the course of 10 to 20 hours and is not easily understood? It's very, very deep indeed. It's difficult to say, because I don't think there's a lot of sales evidence that backs up the theory that we do, which is unfortunate because in television there are indeed many, many pieces of evidence that indicate that yes, this is what people want. There are high-quality series all the time. Sons of Anarchy is a great example. Breaking Bad is a great example. Go back in time a little bit, The Shield is a stellar example of anti-heroes. Like, I watched the entirety of that, all 7 seasons, and I always felt myself wrestling with the idea, hang on, is this guy the good guy, the bad guy? Am I supposed to be rooting for him? Am I supposed to hate him? And I think I found that I had both of those feelings in equal measure for many of the characters, in that there wasn't really a good guy in that entire series, and that is what we need in video games, and I have yet to see a really good example of that. I think the one that's got closest, aside from Planescape, would probably be Witcher 2, but for the most part we don't see things like that, and here's hoping it eventually happens, but it seems like at the moment it's just a little bit out of reach. Maybe Project Eternity will allow that. But we won't be seeing anything from that until at least 2014, so here's hoping. Okay, folks, that's me done for the day. Thank you very much for watching the Mailbox. I'll see you next time.